This is Korean Heroes. Episode 5 of the series on Isun Shin. Catch a Tiger by the Tail. In the first days of the war, the already towering confidence of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's generals was swollen to its greatest extent. He had already been victorious on the home islands in his effort to unify Japan, and when he came forth in an unstoppable flood, trampling all in front of him, it was a lightning blitz from Busan to Seoul in the first month of the war that crippled the Chosun right away. If they were not stopped, then he would be banging on the gates of the great Middle Kingdom, the Ming Empire, by the end of the summer. And that's what the plan was. But a wrench would be thrown in the gears, eventually causing the whole thing to seize up. The supercharged confidence and optimism that they gained was not unwarranted, but the Japanese were overconfident. Nothing seemed beyond their ability, and nothing seemed capable of halting their relentless advance. The Japanese army was really, truly a war machine. The best chance of defending the peninsula was the impressive Chosun Navy, but it had evaporated without firing a single shot. The Chosun garrisons tried to resist, but they were overwhelmed as often as their field armies melted away in front of the advance. The Korean government was paralyzed. The people of Korea were confused and uninformed and basically helpless. The military commanders that were in charge were inexperienced or ineffective, and the Japanese were battle-hardened and equipped with superior weapons. I mean, come on. They had guns, and the Koreans were just handling bows. The main problem with this was guns were easy to use and any peasant could fire them, but archery required a lot of training and precision, and if you've ever seen Koreans fire bows and arrows in the Olympics, you know they're excellent at it, but that takes years of practice, and the average Korean couldn't pick up a bow and use it effectively. Whereas the Japanese had experience and access to all the arquebuses, the ancient muskets. They're really old style weapons, but they did the job. Even if the Korean army had been well led and well prepared, the task would have been nearly impossible. Even a well-trained European army of the day would have had trouble with this Japanese army. No sizable army in history has overcome this kind of technological and numerical advantage. There were nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers by midsummer fanning out from Busan, the staging area, and no army on earth at the time could have stemmed that tide. No army could have, but what about a navy? That was the thing that Isun Shin had said in his memoirs right away, is if only we had taken them on the water when we had the chance, when they were being transported, then the peninsula could have been saved. So hold on a sec. There's still a few Korean ships kicking around somewhere with a half-decent chance of stopping them and a half-decent commander leading them. So maybe this half-decent commander will have something to say about this situation? Of course, I'm speaking of Isun Shin, the man we've been talking about for 4 episodes so far. And like a razor-sharp needle puncturing a hot air balloon, his own lightning attacks, his own blitz, will deflate this overextended, overconfident hot air of Hideyoshi's army, causing it to deflate and slowly settle back down to earth as gravity intended. Presenting the now 45-year-old, but new and improved Isun Shin, commander of the Jeolla Province Left Navy. Chung Mugong, don't call it a comeback. Explosion, overpowered. Yi Sun-shin seems to have had no shortage of confidence, but the situation was dire indeed. If he were to lose, the way to the Yellow Sea would be wide open, and that is exactly what Hideyoshi wanted. This is one of the qualities that always sets him apart from his contemporaries, especially in the Chosun army and in the military in general. He had unswerving confidence and courage. Yi Sun-shin was well informed of the task that lay before him, and he took it on nonetheless. He wasn't afraid of the pressure, and I believe he was not just courageous. He actually knew what he was capable of and what his men were capable of doing, and he took advantage. He made calculations. So it's a confidence in something realistic, not just a confidence in hoping or praying that something will turn out to his advantage. So this is how Samuel Hawley describes the situation in Chapter 10, The Korean Navy Strikes Back, in his book on the Imjin War. Now that Hideyoshi's armies had advanced halfway up the Korean peninsula to Seoul, it was becoming essential that a seaborne supply line be established so that reinforcements, weapons, and food stores could be brought forward in preparation for the coming push to China. The entire enterprise hinged on the opening of this sea route. Without it, everything would have to be carried all the way from the Pusan beachhead to the advancing front, and every soldier would have to walk a distance already of hundreds of kilometers over mountainous terrain. After their task of ferrying the first 8 contingents of the Japanese army from Nagoya to Busan, therefore, squadrons from Hideyoshi's 700-ship fleet began probing westward along Korea's southern coast, feeling their way through treacherous channels around rocky headlands and into potentially hostile territory, reaching out for the Yellow Sea and the way north. They made it about 80 kilometers before they were stopped in their tracks. I concluded episode 4 with the declaration, "The God of War is coming." And I want to make it clear that that was never a title used to describe Yi Sun-shin in his day. But I do understand its popularity on the internet now, as he does occupy a sort of exalted place in the Korean pantheon, as did the great heroes and generals of Roman antiquity. Often in ancient societies, you would turn a general into a god after his death, so it's the same sort of thing. However, for our purposes, I will refer to him by his military ranks of commander and admiral and his honorary posthumous title, Chungmugong. Anyway, despite his desire for action, Yi Sun-shin still bided his time. The Japanese fleet was creeping westward ever closer to his jurisdiction, and he needed to be ready. He couldn't actually just jump in and attack them technically because he needed to wait for orders from the government, which were slow to come down, but once they came, he was ready to pounce. 2/3 of the Chosun Navy had been lost. They had sunk it themselves, as I explained before. If you didn't catch the earlier episodes, basically 2/3 of the Chosun fleet just self-destructed out of panic, and he needed to consolidate his forces. He committed himself to consolidating the remaining third. When his colleague Ieokgi, the commander of the Jeolla Province Right Navy, arrived, their combined strength would include 24 Panoksan, their large warships. I've included some pictures of these ships on the website. And 15 Hyupsan, small warships, and 46 Pojaksan, which are basically just fishing and merchant vessels that were used for scouting and supplies and support. They were sort of converted for Yi Sun-shin's purposes. And, of course, let's not forget the remnants of the mighty Gyeongsang fleet, the 200 ships that disappeared. There were 3 large and 3 small ships remaining. The resourceful Wongyun managed to sneak away with those 6 ships after he destroyed upwards of 80 warships of his own and dispersed their crews all over the countryside. Technically, Wongyun still held the same rank as the 2 Yis, but his authority was obviously limited to his paltry 6-ship fleet, so he's the commander of 6 ships. In time, This would prove fortunate for Isun-shin and the Chosun kingdom because his errors in judgment would continue and culminate in an even greater catastrophe. Possibly, you could argue a greater catastrophe. It's hard to imagine, but he will somehow manage to supersede his grand opening act of blowing up his own navy by losing the entire Chosun navy again. Some people just have a talent for creating disaster. And I don't want to blame Won-gyun too much because history has painted him that way, but it sure seems like he should take the lion's share of the blame. Isun-shin's approach was diametrically opposed to that of his colleague Won-gyun. That's why they didn't get along, beyond the personal reasons. But for the most part, Isun-shin didn't take things personally. Professionally, he didn't get along with him. He knew he was outnumbered and that he would be in for a tough fight, so he drilled his men and stocked up on supplies, as opposed to what Won-gyun used to do, which is usually take it easy and enjoy himself with some women and some wine. Korean rice wine, I imagine, not the grape type. Anyway, Isun-shin was busy stoking the fiery patriotism of his men, and he boosted their morale any way he could, mostly with his unshakable confidence, but also he maintained harsh and strict discipline, so there was a certain amount of fear and respect that he commanded as well. Isun-shin was definitely not a Care Bear. Even to his own people, he is a very caring person when it comes to the Chosun people that cannot protect themselves, but when it comes to soldiers, deserters, dissenters, and thieves, they would get no quarter under his command. So as he was making his preparations for his push east into Gyeongsang province, some outspoken captains grumbled and expressed their reservations about the plan. Isun-shin stood up to talk to them, and this is what his nephew Ipun writes that he said before they disembarked on their mission. Chungmugong rose and declared in a solemn voice, "At this time, when our national safety is at stake, before the fierce enemy attacking all points, how can you stand back to keep the local boundary line on the plea of being the sailors of another province? I only sounded your opinion to test your loyalty and patriotism. Today, we have only one duty, to fight and die. If anyone says no, I shall cut off his head." All people present trembled with fear and pledged to die in battle. Isun-shin does not mess around. You were either inspired to fight with ferocity or scared into it. I'm not sure Isun-shin really cared which when it came down to it, just that his men were ready to fight. Either way, like I said before, D is for discipline. Thus, when the fleet got underway, parting Yasu at 2 a.m. in the morning, under the cover of darkness, it was not the grandest fleet in Korean history, but it was, perhaps, the most well-prepared. Isun-shin was also well-informed, with detailed knowledge of the coastal waters. Even though he was not an experienced naval commander, he wasn't even a sailor. He was born in Hanyang, not in Mokpo or Yasu or on the coast. But he pored over the maps in preparation. He always knew exactly. He sought advice about things that he wasn't aware of, and he was always well informed before he fought. The Chosun would now have the opportunity to prove their superior seamanship with the advantage of surprise. The Japanese invaders had no idea they were coming. After sailing all night and all through the next day, he rendezvoused with Iyaki at the time he had predetermined, where they waited, of course, until the tardy Won-gyun arrived with his token 6-ship force. With the entire navy, formerly 30% of its strength, but of course now the whole kit and caboodle, united, they moved farther east, making their way toward Kaje Island, where at dawn the next day they could make out Okpo Harbor. I've been to Kaje Island, by the way. It's really nice, but it wouldn't look the same back then, 400 years ago. In the clear morning air of May 7th, 1592, the Korean crews could see plumes of smoke rising in the air from the town and warships anchored close to the shore. Okpo was on fire. Immediately, seeing what was going on, Isun-shin, they picked up speed and rowed powerfully to the steady cadence of Isun-shin's war drums, the Chosun warships closed in on their quarry. At a signal from their commander, they unleashed volleys of cannonballs, preventing the Japanese ships from maneuvering. Since they were caught by surprise, they were having trouble preparing themselves to meet the challenge of the 28 Panoksun that quickly began to close the noose, trapping 26 of the 50-some-odd ships against the coast. Moving into shorter range, the Chosun cannons were devastating, ripping through the lighter Japanese hulls as archers showered their decks with flaming arrows and metal. One by one, the boats became hulking, burning funeral pyres, the sea around them covered with shattered wood, corpses, and supplies. Now, if you look at my website, the banner at the top of it, KoreanHeroes.net, if you look at the banner at the top, it's Iaki and Isun-shin staring at each other with a bunch of burning wood and remnants of ships in the background. This is exactly what I'm talking about. That's an illustration on my banner of my website. This is the scene that we're talking about. As the Japanese ships were being torn apart and left in pieces floating on the water, the carnage continued unabated until all the Japanese sailors and soldiers had fled inland or been fortunate enough to escape on a surviving ship, because roughly half of them, did get away because the Japanese actually outnumbered the Korean fleet, especially in terms of the large warships. But because they were surprised, they were unable to defend themselves, so half of them got away, the others were caught. Isun-shin was said to remark, as the battle concluded, "This is like putting fish on a skewer." Or, if you prefer a different translation, skewering a fish. It was the Chosun equivalent, really, of saying, this is like shooting fish in a barrel, or, if you prefer, the American idiom, it was a turkey shoot. The main reason for the outcome of this battle was, of course, the element of surprise. But we can see already that the firepower that Isun-shin has at his disposal is going to be a huge factor in every battle. Beyond the sheer number of cannons that we talked about, the Korean warships have roughly 5 to 10 more cannons than each large Japanese warship, but it's also the technology itself. The Koreans had imported cannons from China more than 200 years before, in the 14th century, and that had allowed them to develop their own cannons adapted to their boats and made improvements and alterations. You've probably heard of, well, maybe you haven't, but if you've heard of Korean heroes or you've heard of famous Koreans, you probably know Sejong the Great, the most famous Korean king, the one who had a team of scholars help him create the Korean language itself, Hangul. He is also credited with improvements in science and technology during his reign, and that was a part of it was artillery development, which increased the range and accuracy of the Korean cannons. So, the Chosun cannons in use during the Imjin War, during this time, could fire over a kilometer, and Isun-shin made his own adaptations to their artillery as well, which we'll talk about later when the turtle ships make their debut. We talked about turtle ships quite a bit last episode, but they're not actually in the fleet yet. They're under construction and being tested out. But he had 4 different types of cannons on those ships called Heaven, Earth, Black, and Yellow, which I love naming things. Maybe you do too. When you have something cool, a toy, or I don't know, a car or anything, you want to give it a good name. Heaven cannon sounds pretty good to me. I think that's awesome. If I had my own cannons, I'd definitely give them cool names. Anyway, we will discuss them in more detail later. Suffice to say that the few weaker cannons without cool names that the Japanese had got overmatched pretty easily, and the Japanese handheld gunpowder weapons, the arquebus that they had, couldn't handle exchanges with the Chosun, even when they were informed and prepared. Just exchanging with a Korean ship, even when there were several Japanese warships against one Korean warship still wasn't really fair. So it was the Japanese that had their hands full, trying to get away with their lives rather than trying to do damage. I'd also just like to look at this from the perspective of the Japanese robbers for a moment. The Chosun called them robbers, and I've avoided calling them that, but that's usually, when it's written, the Chosun history, that's always, they refer to them as robbers more often than not. I don't want to be too biased, but in this case, they are literally robbing, the population blind here, looting and carrying away stuff and lighting everything else on fire. So these guys are literally Japanese robbers, not just the soldiers that are behaving themselves. These guys are robbers. They're thieves. So imagine you were having a great morning, stealing, pillaging, terrorizing the local Korean civilians, doing whatever you want without any fear of reproach, when suddenly large Chosun warships start emerging through the smokescreen created by your own fires of your own raiding party. You probably would have looked up and kind of done a double take and rubbed your eyes, squinting, and said, am I hallucinating? As this kind of reality started to sink in. The officers in the Japanese army probably they definitely knew what the outcome of the Battle of Busan was, and they would have seen the remnants of the Chosun fleet that was wrecked. So they probably thought to themselves, the Chosun fleet was gone. What is this? It was confirmed that several hundred ships were scuttled and sunk and their weapons destroyed. So what is this fleet appearing out of nowhere? Looking through the veil of smoke and fire, what would they have thought? I mean, Japanese people are superstitious, especially with ghosts. Maybe they thought it was a ghost fleet. It may have indeed crossed their mind, but as ship after ship became visible and, tangible evidence of cannon fire and arrows flying into their comrades proved that it was not a ghost fleet, a sense of dread must have settled over them, and panic. Dozens of Korean warships, under full sail, rowing to the ominous beat of their war drums, were now bearing down on them. Running about frantically, trying to gather themselves, some of them must have instantly regretted not following the Kampaku's standing orders. Because, in fact, Toyotomi Hideyoshi had expressly forbidden looting and pillaging, because he believed, rightly so, that treating the Chosun people with respect and forbidding his own soldiers from looting and pillaging would prevent native resistance from springing up. However, his men disobeyed, seeing that there was no navy to deter them from their behavior. The Gyeongsang coastlines were undefended. They took advantage. But now they would pay the price for their lack of discipline, and the instrument of justice had arrived, Yi Sun-shin's combined Jeolla province fleet. As the Korean soldiers and sailors were going about their grim business of annihilating the cornered Japanese ships and scattering their crews on the sea, some civilians were caught in the crossfire, and some were lucky to survive. The account of a captive Korean girl has come down to us when she later described the scene. This is what she said. Cannonballs and long arrows poured down like hail on the Japanese ships. Those who were struck by the missiles fell dead, bathed in blood, while others rolled on the deck with wild shrieks or jumped into the water to climb up the hills. At that time, I remained motionless with fear in the bottom of the boat for long hours, so I did not know what was happening in the outside world. It's sometimes easy to forget that there's a lot of civilians involved here, not just the armies, but there's people caught in between who are not fighting but just victims. But in terms of military casualties, at the end of the day, the Chosun Navy had not lost a ship. In terms of human casualties, only 3 Koreans were injured. Amazingly, only 3. No deaths. Whereas 26 Japanese warships went down, and they took countless men with them. Hundreds, perhaps even thousands of Japanese drowned or were killed by Chosun cannon fire and arrows. This was nearly a flawless victory, if there ever was one. And after the battle, despite his men's desire to clean up and pursue the enemy who had fled inland, Isunshin refused to split his forces and make himself vulnerable. Instead, he chose to retire to open water, knowing he was in his element and well protected. He held the home field advantage when he was on the water. It was time to rest and recuperate. Except, it was not time to rest and recuperate. Rest was not in the cards. Just as they were sitting down to replenish themselves and have a meal, a patrol boat returned claiming that 5 ships had been spotted nearby. So, of course, putting down everything, Isunshin immediately set off in hot pursuit, his thirst for vengeance still greater than his need for sustenance. Spying the incoming Chosun ships, the 5 Japanese ships beelined to the near shore and disappeared into the forested hills. I mean, not the boats disappeared, but the crews abandoned ship and disappeared into the hills. The Chosun had to content themselves with torching those 5 warships and watching them collapse into the water. Then they returned to the flotilla on the open sea. By that time, it was nearly midnight. That's a long day. A battle that lasted from morning until evening, and then chasing ships until midnight, and then finally, stopping to rest. Again, though, their rest was short-lived. In the morning, there was a fresh report of Japanese activity farther down the west coast of Kaje Island, and they got that information at sunrise. So they set sail in search of the raiders, and then were able to surprise 13 warships, just as they had the day before. Again, the Japanese made no attempt to fight as they booked it into the forested hills. The Koreans set about torching and looting the enemy ships. As they stood on their decks in triumph, looking at what they had accomplished, they received a Korean refugee carrying a crying baby strapped to his back. He was begging them for help, explaining the Japanese had taken everything of value, including the people's cows, horses, and food. Isunshin offered to take him away by ship, but he refused, as he had been separated from his wife and elderly mother. As you can imagine, the tragic plight of this man affected Isunshin and reignited the fires inside his heart, the fires of vengeance, and he began to plan further retaliating raids to punish these evil invaders. But then, suddenly, a messenger scrambled onto the deck from a nearby ship. He burst into tears as he announced to Chungmugong that Hanyang, Seoul, modern-day Seoul, the capital, had already fallen, and King Sunjo had fled north to Pyongyang. The Chosun government was in exile. With this uncertainty of the fate of the Chosun kingdom hanging like a pall above them right after their first victory, the commanders decided to dissolve the combined fleet and return to their home ports for repairs and to resupply while they waited for additional news from the government. As you can see, the whole command structure of the Chosun kingdom has been upset by the invasion, and the rapidity of the thrust northward, the blitz of the Japanese advance, has cut off communication between the Navy, the remaining part of the Navy, Isunshin's command, and the government itself. So this will both be a difficulty and, in some ways, I think, a blessing for Isunshin, because this is kind of allowing him to be, once he gets going, and the government says, okay, we can't really give you orders, Isunshin, just do what you have to do. He's off the leash. And since he knows the situation strategically, then he can plan properly and take advantage of situations that the government is not even aware of. So soon, when the government is completely unable to send and communicate properly with Isunshin, he will have the opportunity to plan his own campaigns and be free to operate in his own sphere. It'll be a big benefit, and perhaps it saved the Chosun in the end, that Isunshin was able to make his own decisions from the top down. But for now, it's really paralyzing the Jella fleet's ability to do anything as well. Over the summer, once he's off the leash, it'll be a benefit. But for now, it's obviously a disadvantage. He couldn't take advantage of his surprise and go after the Japanese Navy further when he had the chance, because now he's going back to Yasu to resupply, rest, and wait to see what's happening with the Chosun Kingdom's future. So this brings us to the end of the opening round. Isunshin obviously emerging as the clear victor. On land, the Japanese have continued their unstoppable advance, but on the water, a fresh conflict has begun. Before retiring to Yasu, the Chosun Navy destroyed 44 warships in 2 days, with a handful of injuries and only superficial damage to its ship. With only a handful of injuries and only superficial damage to its ships. That's incredible. And this sort of performance is only going to ramp up. A dangerous enemy was loose in the Korean kingdom, but Isunshin had this tiger by the tail. One last remark I would like to make before I conclude episode 5 is that it's important to remember how devastating and terrible this war was to so many people, as all wars are. By the end of this war, as many as 2 million Korean people will have been captured, killed, and forcibly relocated, making it a national disaster almost without equal. Only the Mongolian invasions hundreds of years before caused as much damage to the Korean state, and we will be discussing that another time. Military commanders can be heartless or even intentionally cruel when it comes to their treatment of civilians. People were being robbed, starved, abused, trampled, kidnapped, and ultimately being killed during the Imjin War. In Korean, it's called the Imjin Weeran. Chosun histories, like almost every other historical records, focus on the heroes and villains in the military and in politics. When we read history, we read about the wealthy and famous, and I'm going to do the same thing in telling this story. However, when I can, I will include the perspective of the commoner, the civilians' experience as well, because we should not forget what happened to them, and because the fact that Isunshin also cared is another distinctive part of his character. It sets him apart and makes his accomplishments that much more admirable, and it elevates him to the ranks of the greatest men in Korean history, if not Asian history overall. At least according to the information we have regarding his conduct and his personality, he seems to have found that delicate balance of decisiveness, ruthlessness, and compassion that earns the adoration, fear, and respect that great leaders use to achieve victory. Maybe that's why I see a bit of Caesar in him, without the hyper-ambitious political drive, but with that same restless energy and ability to multitask and see things in the future that other people can't see. It's a personal observation I've made as a fan of both of these famous historical figures. So please stay tuned as the indomitable Isunshin navigates his way through the treacherous waters of South Korea and continues to tackle the gargantuan task of dislodging the Japanese menace from the Chosun Kingdom.